Welcome to Your Lettings Journey, a brand new podcast that's essential listening for landlords with property in North London. Now, everyone will have their own unique landlord journey, from the way they get into property to the way they hang up or pass on their keys, and then all the different decisions in between. But along the way, we're all faced by many of the same issues and potential pitfalls. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Romesh, and together we have a lifetime of experience as landlords, letting agents and tenants that we want to share with you to help you navigate your lettings journey.
So if you're an experienced landlord wanting to make sure that you're keeping on the right side of all the rules and regulations, or if you're completely new to this game and don't know where to start, then this is the podcast for you.
Your Lettings Journey is produced by Belvoir Enfield and Central Housing Group. For more information, visit belvoir.co.uk/Enfield and centralhousinggroup.com.
Hello. This week we're looking at one of the more difficult aspects of property rental, and that's evictions. Now, it's not somewhere where anyone wants to find themselves, whether they're landlord, tenant or agent. So why does it happen? How does it happen? And are there any steps we can take to reduce the likelihood of it? Okay, welcome. Let's get cracking. Romesh, this week we're talking about evictions. It's not a nice subject, not something that people really want to be involved in, whether you're a tenant or a landlord. But why? What are some of the reasons that people find themselves looking at eviction?
Okay, so firstly, Rachel, about evictions, just wanted to say evictions is an action of last resort. But once we move on from that, there are a number of reasons why landlords might want to need to evict a tenant. One, their mortgage costs have gone up and they're falling into arrears, or they're struggling themselves. They have tenants suffering rent arrears who are not paying. And some landlords just want to get out of the market now. They've had enough and they need to then free their property up because they're selling, and the EPCs, landlord licensing. These are changes that have affected landlords in a way which has put them off, I think, sometimes. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so we'll go through the process of how people would get their properties back, but that very much depends on the type of rental that you have. So whether people are going down the private route or they're doing a guaranteed rent through a scheme like yourselves, and also what the reason is for wanting a property back. So just briefly, how would you top line the ways that you can get your property back as a landlord if you want it back?
There's sort of two principal ways in terms of if you were looking to go down the eviction route. There's a couple of notices you've got to serve. So there's a Section 8 notice where you need to demonstrate that there's been a breach of the tenancy. So that could be rent arrears, antisocial behaviour, etc., or nuisance. And the other one is Section 21, where you can serve a notice and there isn't essentially a breach of the tenancy by that tenant, but you are allowed to evict them because there's no fault of their own, but you simply want your property back.
That one's always struck me as a little bit tricky. And I know there's been a lot of things in the press recently about landlords just randomly throwing people out of properties, which always strikes me as a bit bizarre. If you have a tenant who's looking after your property and paying the rent, why would you want to do that? And then also where there's the suggestion that a lot of landlords are looking at the market saying, my existing tenant's been there for a few years. They're only paying this amount of rent. If I put it out in the open market now, I can get, 200, 300, 400 more. Therefore, I'm going to evict my tenant and put them out on the open market. Do you think that's happening a lot? Is Section 21 being used in that way? Or what's the reason that Section 21s are so much used over the Section 8?
I think sometimes with Section 21, I think there's a bit of a myth that landlords, like you say, are just evicting tenants left, right and centre for no reason, just wanting to get more rent. I don't think that is the truth or the case. Where landlords do want more rent, they tend to, you would talk to your tenant and discuss it and see if you can agree way forward. So it would only be an action of last resort. We'll talk about the costs and the process because there's a lot to it. So I don't think that is quite true. But an example would be, so if you wanted to sell your property, okay, clearly the tenant's not breached the agreement that they've got with you, but you have the right to sell it and you have the right to want to do something different with your investment. Or it might be that you've had enough of being a landlord and you're retiring. In the same way, you want to sell or you want to hand it on to a family member, or you've got someone moving in. Those are not breaches. So you have to ask for your property back. And Section 21 is the way that you do that, where there's a non-breach. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, Rachel.
I mean, it sort of does. I think that's how most people see it ordinarily being used. There is no fault. I just want it back. But I think generally you see people who see that Section 21, so I get there in the end, Rachel, but Section 21, by its very nature, there's no defence against it. It's just a matter of, I'm giving you notice, I'd like my property back. It's not your fault. Therefore, there is no defence for the tenant in terms of, well, actually, no, that's not the case, and I want to stay in a property. It's just happened. So if you look at any of the Section 8 grounds, and there are 17 different Section 8 grounds. So rent arrears, for example, serious rent arrears of 2 months or more, that's a mandatory Section 8 grounds. So theoretically, if you go to court, you should, without any doubt, get your property back. But there is, of course, the issue of, well, if the rent arrears are paid off before you get to court, you've possibly spent money on going to court and all the paperwork, and then you're left with a tenant in your property who, yes, they may well be up to date on their rent, but your trust has broken down because you're at the point where you're taking them to court. So you really don't want that person in your property, despite the fact that they are now not in arrears. Yeah. And if you go on any other grounds, so if they're just regularly late with their rent, or if there's a minor breach, so if they've got a pet, for example, and it's a no pet property, if they're smoking inside but it's a no smoking property, or if they're damaging the property, so if they're neglecting the property or deliberately damaging it, or if somebody else has moved in, all those sorts of things, those are discretionary. And generally people, if they feel the need to make a discretionary claim, then they will either go down the Section 21 route, or they're encouraged to have more than one discretionary grounds. Because if you go to court and you say, okay, these people have got a dog in my house, you may well find that the judge, when you get to court, says, well, actually, no, it's not unreasonable for them to have a dog. Therefore, so long as the dog isn't damaging the property in any way, particularly nowadays, so long as it's not actually damaging the property, there's no reason to evict them. Or if they're smoking, it may be, okay, they say they've given up a couple of days ago, or if they do start smoking, they're going to smoke outside. Therefore, it's not reasonable, And most judges don't want to make people homeless. Yes. So for those sorts of reasons, a lot of people will resort to a Section 21. The most common one that I see, though, forgetting pets and smoking and everything else, is antisocial behaviour.
Yes.
So people who are making a lot of noise and disturbing the neighbours, or who are doing something illegal or immoral or what have you, the burden of proof, if you go to court, is quite high.
Yes.
And that's obviously quite expensive. That's additional expenses. So people in that situation will quite often say, I'm just going to serve a Section 21 instead. And so that's something that's scaring a lot of people going forward, is if the Section 21 does get withdrawn, and so that there is no Section 21, which is obviously part of the renters reform, then the Section 8 grounds have really got to be toughened up to make it more landlord friendly.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the government are talking about trying to do that, but the proof will be in the pudding when they sort of
absolutely. And there's not a huge amount of trust. If you talk about landlords and government, there's not a huge amount of trust, because landlord bashing does seem to be quite easy at the moment, and quite a vote winner, unfortunately. So there's not a lot of trust that, the new Section 8 is going to be the be all and end all for us. And to be honest, that's where tenant selection, which I know we'll do at another date, becomes so important, because if going to evict is the last resort now, it's going to be even worse in future.
Absolutely. Okay, so in terms of evictions, can we sort of run through the typical costs and timescale sort of involved in that whole process?
I don't know if there's anything like a typical cost as such, but the costs that you have will depend on how you approach it, and also the type of eviction. So a lot of our landlords have rent guarantee cover. Yeah. And if they're going to evict somebody, whether it's because of Section 8 or it's a no fault possession, then if the person hasn't gone by the end of the notice period, the rent guarantee kicks in, and all of the costs for that, court costs, lawyer costs, etc., that's all paid for by the rent guarantee company. You have companies who are tenant evict specialists, and you can either have a full package of beginning to end eviction, or you can pay step by step. So I wrote down some costs step by step that I found online for one of them. So issuing notice, whether it's a Section 8 or a Section 21, it's £300. That's just serving the paperwork, reviewing the file, serving the paperwork. Applying to court, and then if necessary, attending court. For a Section 21, you're looking at roughly £1,000.
Wow.
For a Section 8, for an arrears Section 8, you're looking at around 1,100, 1150. And if you're looking at a bailiff, you're then looking at £330. So, and that's if it's an easy eviction. That's just Section 21, write it, send it to the courts, wait for the courts to come back with a date. Tenant hasn't gone by that date, get the bailiffs go out. So that's that. Then it gets more expensive depending on some of the nuances within it. So if you have a non-standard tenancy agreement and you want them to raise the paperwork for Section 21, so if you have perhaps a verbal agreement, or you can't find the tenancy agreement, or something like that, but something's not right with it, you're looking at £700 to serve the paperwork.
Oh, wow.
If you have a Section 8 that isn't just serious rent arrears, but is something else, then there's an extra hourly rate for them putting the case together because of all the evidence that's needed. Getting examples of, talking to neighbours, or getting examples of antisocial behaviour, for example, keeping the records of it, making sure everything is in place. That all takes time. Yeah. So again, another reason to be concerned in future. And when it comes to bailiffs, there's always the option of going to High Court bailiffs rather than County Court bailiffs, but that's around £1,300.
£1,300 for the
High Court bailiff, or for them to get the High Court bailiff. So that's the cost of the bailiff and also their costs in securing you the High Court bailiff.
Really? £1,300? Oh, wow.
But it's £330 to just use to get the County Court bailiff.
So £1,000 more to use a High Court. Oh gosh, I didn't realise it was that much more expensive.
Well, that's just with these people. That's just all rolled into their costs.
Sure.
If you go down the route of using a local solicitor, who specialises in property but doesn't necessarily specialise in evictions, then they will have very different rates, and it depends on the solicitor you go to. It's going to be based on the amount of time they spend on it, I believe. So, it's one to think about. And then there are a lot of people who consider doing it themselves as well, and that has potential issues with it, or potential risks with it.
Yeah, that's definitely got risks, as if you make mistakes in that process, small administrative mistakes, that's going to cost you in terms of time. And obviously, if you had a tenant in arrears, then that would be another matter altogether, because you'd be losing rent as well as the time. But yeah, oh gosh, I didn't realise the cost of evictions are so high these days.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's also a very long process. So we had an eviction recently, and from the point of applying to court through to actually getting a property back with bailiffs was 10 months. Now, this person was very lucky that the rent was being paid by, or the landlord was very lucky rent was being paid by rent guarantee scheme. But if you imagine that you're not being paid any rent at that, during that process, that could be quite expensive.
Very painful. I mean, as a comparison, what we do working with landlords in terms of guaranteed rent and schemes that we do with the council. So in terms of getting your property back on that type of scheme, there isn't a formal mechanism and process in the way that there is with this. It's a case of a landlord serving a notice on us and saying, I'd like my property back because my agreement's come to an end or whatever, or circumstances have changed. And so in that situation, basically we're reliant on the local authority to find alternative accommodation and move them on. And what invariably happens is that they'll ask us and they'll look and see. But current situation, as we were discussing last week, there is a real shortage of properties out there. So they're struggling to move people on. And I've got cases in some situations where it's taking up to a year plus for the council to move a family. And I've still got families who've been in a property more than a year, and that landlord wants their property back and is waiting for it. Obviously, completely and utterly frustrated with us. As much as we try and explain the situation, they've got an agenda and their own sort of life to lead and circumstances they want to sort of deal with, basically. So
I think that must be hugely frustrating, because, I mean, your landlords will likely be the same as mine in that, as you said earlier, a lot of people, because of increased mortgage rates, etc., or other changes in the law, are finding themselves wanting their properties back again. So even if you're doing it through the Section 21 or Section 8 or what have you process, at least there is that step by step. You can see each stage progressing. You know what the next stage is.
yes.
I think the longest gap we had was waiting for a date from the bailiffs, which took 17 weeks. Well, not waiting for the date, but the date between applying for the bailiff and the actual eviction was 17 weeks. We obviously got notification in the middle of that, but that was the longest delay, was waiting for the date to be given for that eviction and then for the eviction to actually happen. Whereas if I'm applying to you and saying I want my property back as a landlord, and then there are no stages within that, just constant repeated requests, that must be hugely frustrating.
It is. I mean, the things that sort of make it slightly more comfortable are that they're not actually not getting paid rent. So they are getting rent in that situation. So from that perspective, they're not financially being penalised. But it is frustrating for them. And the thing that we have to sort of try and point out to them sometimes is to sort of indicate, well, if you were to let this property privately and you had a tenant that didn't go because they were unable to move on, there would be a process of serving notice, going to court, which does take, we tend to think, sort of 6 to 12 months on average, pre-COVID that was. So we sort of try to temper their expectation a little bit so that they can understand that, it could happen if you had a private tenant that says, I can't move on. But that's still no comfort because they don't know exactly when they're going to get their property back and there's no defined structure to it.
And as you say, with a lot of people who are now looking at or considering getting their properties back because they need to sell them, the ability to be able to say, yes, I'm going to have vacant possession on this date is actually really quite important.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it leads to the additional expense of making sure that your property is actually vacant at that point and then putting it on the market, which could mean that your property's empty for another, 4, 5, 6, however many months.
Yeah. I mean,
which again is an additional cost.
I've seen landlords who asked for their properties back, not necessarily through us, but you've noticed it, and they've approached us where they got it back, but it took a long time. And then by the time they go to the market had changed, as we've seen in sort of since about October time last year. The sales market sort of started to go quieter and decline. So landlords who tried to act prior to that and sort of get steps in motion to sell suddenly found themselves with an empty property in a really weak sales market, which it's unfortunate in terms of timing. But unfortunately, this is one of the things with property. It's not a case of my contract has ended on this date and that's it. The tenant will go and disappear and then I will have my property back. I recently had a landlord who said, well, Romesh, the contract ends on this date, so I want my property back. Why can't I have it back? And I said, well, unfortunately, people are living in properties and the law is such that you can't just go there and turf them out. I had to sort of explain that to them and say, look, there is a process. If they refuse to go or they're not able to go, there is a delay in a process that you have to follow. He wasn't happy. I think he was working on the basis that, well, if I buy a building insurance policy and then I have it for a year and I want to switch, it automatically ends and it starts with somebody new, or I can terminate it at any point. But sort of getting that message through was a bit of a struggle.
I think it's all about why you come into lettings or when you're planning on ending, your whole strategy. So what is your actual journey going to be? Because for a lot of landlords and a lot of people in general, you think I have a contract for this amount of time. And even though there might be something I have to do beforehand, I would expect to get my property back at this time or to have that option at that point. So if somebody starts with they take out a tenant with us, a private tenant, they've got a 12-month fixed term contract. It maybe gets renewed, but they know that they can issue notice at 2 months notice at any point to be able to get that property back. And dependent on the tenant type and the market, they're more than likely going to get their property back at that because most people, let's face it, don't want to be taken to court. Nobody's sitting in their home and thinking, oh, I'm a nice normal person. I've been paying my rent, whether that's me paying it personally or the council paying for me. Nobody is sitting there thinking, oh well, you know what, I'm going to sit here and deliberately wait until the bailiffs appear. I'm going to go through the court process. I'm going to wait for the bailiffs to turn up. And then only when they're on my doorstep am I going to take the letter from them and give it to the council. Nobody really wants that to happen.
You're absolutely right. Normal private renters don't want that to happen, and I suspect will go out and look for another property and move on. However, there is a large tenant base in Enfield, particularly. Where tenants are on low incomes, on local housing allowance, and they're in a situation where they're struggling now to find alternative properties to rent. So as a consequence, they're being, if they do approach the local authority for some advice, their initial advice will be, here's a list of letting agents, go and speak to these agents who will work with you, potentially, and who have signed up to, some of the code and the requirements of the local authorities. But if they're struggling still, and they go back to the local authority say, well, we don't actually need to assist you right this minute because you have got a roof over your head. Stay put until that situation is forced. And that means that landlord is then having to go to court and start that whole eviction process, which is going to cost them money and time and effort, etc. But yeah,
I know we disagree a little bit on the council's position here. I know I risk us having a heated debate on this one. From a council's point of view, I can just imagine if I was working for the council, the current situation where there is, in Enfield alone, there's been a 42% drop in the supply of rental properties.
Yeah.
And in the past 12 months, from April 22, there's a 84% drop in the number of properties that are within the LHA rate, because of course the LHA rate hasn't gone up since 2020.
Yeah.
So actually, if you're coming out and you are receiving, if you're on you've got a low income or you're receiving any kind of benefits, then being able to find a property that you can A, afford, and that B, the landlord is going to think, yes, you are the most attractive person who's coming to, who's interested in my property.
Yeah.
It's actually incredibly difficult. So while I say most people don't want to be taken to court and or to have bailiffs and will find someplace else to live, it's very difficult for everybody at the moment because, like the example you gave last week of, was it Chadwell Heath?
That's
and
right.
162 people ridiculously turning up for a viewing and 50 applications. Even if it's for a property that's within the LH or lower than the LHA rate, if you've got half a dozen people in front of you where you've got both people working, both can individually afford the rent if they happen to split up or whatever else, and both therefore are going to want to leave should that tenant or should the landlord want the property back, it's then that much more attractive for that landlord to say, I'm going to take any one of these 6 couples over these people who are receiving housing benefit.
Sure.
Particularly as we look at the whole, do you have a guaranteed rent or do you have rent guarantee? And then if not, and you try and evict and it takes 10 months and you're not getting any rent during that period, at that worst case, you're going to want to have a guarantor there, because otherwise you're just like, okay, I'm taking this person. It's a massive gamble because I could be 10 months of rent out if I ever want to get my property back. It's a horrible situation.
Well, it is. I mean, it's really interesting you say that. I actually just took on a landlord this week in Enfield, off Ordnance Road near Enfield Lock. And he had a 3-bedroom house he bought, I think, in 2007, owned it for 13 odd years. Or he had a tenant, housing benefit tenant there for 13-14 years. And November 20, the tenant's housing benefit claim was stopped. And then he was trying to contact his tenant and sort of get to the bottom of what was going on. And the tenant was gone to ground a little bit and said that they were self-employed, et cetera, et cetera. So he ended up getting to a position where he had to serve notice. And it wasn't until the summer of 21, he served notice and he didn't get his property back for a further 12 months because of COVID delays and the courts, etc. So he alone has suffered 18 months of rent loss because of a situation where you've got a housing benefit tenant. There was no guarantor in place, so he wasn't able to go and reach a third party to cover the rent arrears. So it's exactly, the type of scenario you just mentioned, really. It's just a massive, massive problem.
That's quite scary. And the impact of COVID and the pandemic and the court closures and eviction bans and everything else is still being felt now. But, particularly at, sort of end of 21, beginning of 22, it was pretty horrible, really, at that point.
Yeah. But going back to your point, Rachel, you were saying we would disagree about the local authorities. I mean, we work...
Sorry, I drifted again, didn't I? I drifted off the point. So, yes.
We work closely with lots of local authorities, but the thing that I have an issue with is that when you offer them a property, they're happy to take a property and use it, but are not willing to actually go ahead and evict that tenant if the agreement has come to an end. And I understand to a degree why they won't want to evict, because they're seen as the last port of... the last stop where you can get help from. And if they're evicting you, then it does look bad. However, it is not the responsibility of local landlords in North London to supply properties to the local authority on an indefinite basis at whichever time it decides to vacate a property. They don't have the right to indefinitely hold a property, in my opinion.
I know that you feel very passionately about this, and I agree with you entirely.
Yeah.
However, the bit where we disagree is that I sit here and I imagine myself in a council officer's position, thinking I have all these people approaching me with their bailiff letters in hand, or who I know are coming up and have told me that they're being served notice, and I have these other people. There's nothing I can do about those people because they are going through the court process and they're going to be evicted. But I have these other people who are sitting with Romesh's company. And Romesh has asked for his property back, and I'm just going to try and keep them there as long as possible. It's not great from a landlord's perspective, no, but from a council officer's perspective, I get it completely. They try very hard with or sometimes they try, depending on the council, they try very hard to keep a tenant in place in a private setting. So they will offer the landlord or the estate agent all sorts of incentives to keep a tenant in place. So although the rent may not go up to over the LHA rate, they will offer an incentive to an upfront financial incentive to keep or to issue a new tenancy agreement, a new fixed term tenancy. So they do all that sort of thing anyway. They will try and find issues with the serving of documents in terms of or protecting of deposits or the tenancy agreement or anything. They will try and find issues with those things to be able to delay the court process. So there's all those sorts of things that they do on our side to try and extend the tenancies and to keep people from being homeless for as long as possible. It stands to reason they will do it on your side as well. The only difference is that your side is much more an agreement between two businesses, yourself and the council. And so it's easier to drag it out for longer until you get to the point where, as we discussed yesterday, where a landlord will get fed up and go and take action himself and go to court and Section 21 or whatever the tenant himself, which is just bizarre because at the point that they're that frustrated, presumably they're already several months into the process, and then they've got to do the Section 21 and themselves take 10 months to get to the end of that. And I think you were saying at that point that it was a surprise to you when the tenant phoned and said, I'm being evicted.
Absolutely, yeah.
So at that point, you're looking at least 18 months from the landlord saying, I want my property back. So I can understand the council delaying, because in that instance, they have kept somebody from being homeless potentially for 18 months.
I agree. I can understand. I mean, in a previous life, I used to work for a local authority.
Yeah, exactly. So you definitely understand it. So I know it's not right from a landlord point of view, and from an individual landlord point of view, it's like the woes of the country and the woes of the council, and even the woes of any individual person that I'm not specifically related to and responsible for are not my problem.
No,
but
absolutely.
At the same time, from a council perspective, what do? You don't have enough places to put people. You are going to resist people being homeless. And
I get it, but
don't forget that during COVID, I think they were saying, was it 200 people a month were presenting as homeless?
Okay.
Which apparently was primarily down to relationship breakups.
Yeah.
But if you've got all these extra people coming along, even at a time of pandemic, and you don't have new properties being built, you've got your council-owned social housing decreasing. You've got the private rental sector decreasing. You can't compete with the increasing rents. You're getting more people on. What do you do? No, I wouldn't
I get
normally
it.
stand up for the council, but I don't see. I mean, what can they do? They
Well,
have
they
to
need.
make it. They make it more attractive for people to hold on to people. They have to somehow invest in new housing, which they
Yep.
can't do at the moment. Or people get moved out of the area and out of London into cheaper housing, or where perhaps housing is more available. Which, of course, is what people do to us as well. So people come to. There were lots of other boroughs who house their people in Enfield.
Yeah.
So a long time ago, in a different world, I was working at Kensington and Chelsea Council.
Okay.
Nothing to do with housing, and I remember coming across a very pregnant lady in one of the public toilets who was crying her eyes out, really, really very sad, because she was looking for council housing, and they were only able to give her temporary accommodation in Enfield. I thought, well, I live in Enfield. It's not that bad.
Yeah.
It's really not that bad. You're crying about it. But yeah, for her, it was a long, long, long way from home.
Yeah.
And I imagine that's exactly the same as Enfield Council do. They move people, out into Hertfordshire and
Harlow
beyond.
and other. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, look, it is a big problem, and I understand the councils are in a predicament, but equally, it doesn't help them by acting in that way, because it will put landlords off from wanting to work with them and deal with them in the future if they operate like that. So, they have to look at it from another perspective as well. They've got to have a business culture about themselves, I think.
But I think it very much depends on the landlord's reasons for being a landlord. So it depends very much on their particular journey.
Yeah.
So if you are a landlord who just wants to have a regular income from your property, you don't want any fuss, you don't want any dilemmas or anything else, and you're going to leave your property. It's, you're 30 years old and this is going to be your pension, or, you're just going to pass it on to your children or whatever, then your kind of scheme is great.
Yeah.
You're not going to have massive voids. You're not going to have months of no rent. If the property's damaged, somebody else is going to pay for it. Fabulous. But if you are, if you don't have that surety about things, if you are going to work abroad and you're renting out your home in the UK, or if you're getting involved in a relationship and, best will in the world, lots of relationships break up, then you need to be sure that you're going to be able to get your property back. And so in those sorts of scenarios, I'd say if it is or was your main home and not an investment, then I would say it's a bit precarious to put that into a guaranteed rent scheme because of the time issues.
Agree. I mean, we get situations, sometimes we get approached by landlords who are like, I'm going to go traveling for a year or 18 months and I'd like to move back into it at that point. At which point we say, look, this type of scheme isn't suitable for you because you've got intention to return to the property, and we cannot be sure we can give you back your property at a defined point in time, because we don't want you coming back from Australia and knocking on the door and saying, I need to move into my house today and my agreement's ended. And I've had that over the years where people have have emigrated to Sri Lanka and they've come back for their children's education and they want to move back into their own home. And then they're stuck because they've got nowhere else to live. And it's like they're applying to or needing help from a local authority almost, which is bizarre. So, yeah, absolutely. You're right. Certain types of properties lend themselves better to certain types of schemes because short-term stuff with very set dates is not suitable. It's much better to let privately to a typical private tenant, that the type that you deal with.
So when it comes to eviction, I think the main thing to think about is, what is your personal journey? So before you start, you've got to be aware of the issues with eviction, but before you start your journey and deciding on the property you're going to get and the sort of tenant you're going to put in, or the sort of scheme that you're going to go through, I think you have to think about, okay, what is my exit strategy? And it's never been more clear in that respect than now. But despite the fact that I think we were saying that Enfield is the Section 21 eviction hotspot for London, which is obviously not great. I'm sure there are lots of reasons for that, but one of the interesting things that I'd heard was Enfield is also the repossession, mortgage-wise repossession. We've had more repossessions in quarter 4 of 2022 than any other area in England and Wales. So I imagine that some of that is having a knock-on effect onto eviction. Some of those are likely to be tenanted properties as well.
Yeah.
But it's still not the norm. And there are lots of things that you can do to protect yourself from the impact of that. So whether it's guaranteed rent scheme or rent guarantee, but the main or having a guarantor even as well. But the main thing really comes down to your tenant selection at the beginning. And I know we'll talk about that on another day, but it's never been clearer that you don't choose your tenant in haste.
Yes.
You choose them very carefully.
Absolutely.
Very carefully.
Yeah.
Particularly now. But yeah, so think about your plan, protect yourself, get the right tenant. And then, as we said yesterday, or last week rather, keep the communication open with your tenant. Keep communicating, keep a good relationship. Make sure you have all of your paperwork in order at the beginning and keep the communication lines open.
Absolutely. No, I think that's excellent advice, Rachel, because that will help make that eviction process smoother if you are having to go through that. Because what I would say to all landlords is, if you're going to go down the eviction process, is think very carefully, but there is a lot of time, effort and work that's required in order to achieve that outcome. So like you say, you want to try and select your tenants as best you can from the outset to prevent yourself from going down that road. But I think we've talked at great length and covered the evictions quite well today, Rachel.
I think we have, and I think we drifted in the middle as well, which I'm getting a bit prone to doing, so we'll be tighter next time.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. On that note, I think we say goodbye.
Absolutely. Okay.
Till next week.
Goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me. If you enjoyed this episode, then we'd love your support. Please subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode of the podcast with your friends.
We'd also love to hear from you about any topics you'd particularly like us to discuss. Please send an email to yourlettingsjourney@gmail.com.
Thanks for listening, and see you for the next episode of Your Lettings Journey. Goodbye.
Goodbye.